What happened after the fall of Sauron? We all know the moment Frodo stood at the crack of doom and the One Ring went into the fire. But Tolkien wrote surprisingly little about what followed that catastrophe, and some of what he did write sits buried in appendices, letters and abandoned drafts. The fate of every servant, every kingdom, and every ring-bearer after Sauron's defeat carries complications that the familiar ending never addresses. Why does Tolkien leave the aftermath in fragments? On the 25th of March, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, Frodo Baggins stood on the slopes of Barad-dûr. The One Ring had reached the mountain of its forging. Gollum seized the ring, and in his struggle at the edge of the crack of doom, he fell into the fire, taking the ring with him. The ring unmade itself in the same flame that had created it. Sauron's will had been poured into that gold for thousands of years. When it dissolved, his power broke completely. He was a Maya, a spirit of the same order as Gandalf and Saruman, but he had invested so much of his native strength in the ring that its destruction reduced him to a powerless spirit, unable ever to take physical form again or to influence the events of Middle-earth. Barad-dur, the great tower he had built with the power of the ring, collapsed. Its foundations had been laid with the same dark craft, and without the ring sustaining them, the tower fell. The Nazgûl, the 9 servants who wore the rings of power Sauron had given them, were destroyed in the same moment. Their existence depended on Sauron's will and on the rings that bound them to him. When that will vanished and the rings lost their power, the 9 wraiths perished. The Battle of the Morannon, fought at the Black Gate on the same day, turned at once. The armies of the West, led by Aragorn and Gandalf, had been fighting a desperate battle against overwhelming numbers. When Sauron fell, his soldiers lost the terror that had driven them. Many fled. Many others, who had served from fear rather than devotion, threw down their weapons. The eagles arrived overhead, and the victory was complete. The calendar question that follows is more complicated than it first appears. Gondor reckoned the beginning of the Fourth Age from the 25th of March in the year 3021 of the Third Age, 2 years after the ring's destruction. That date marked the departure of the ring-bearers from Middle-earth, when Frodo and Bilbo sailed from the Grey Havens with Elrond, Galadriel and Gandalf. But other calendars in Middle-earth counted the New Age differently. The Shire reckoned the Fourth Age as beginning on the 22nd of September in the year 1422 by Shire reckoning, which was the day after Frodo's departure. The Hobbits of the Shire had their own calendar, and they marked the change of age from the day they lost their most famous resident. These differences in reckoning mean that the transition from one age to the next was not a single moment recognized by everyone at once. It was a political and cultural decision made differently by different peoples, based on what mattered most to each one. The fate of Sauron's servants after his fall is one of the most complex questions Tolkien addressed, and the answers vary sharply depending on which servants we examine. The Nazgûl were gone. The 9 rings of power that Sauron had distributed to men had bound their wearers to his will across centuries. When the One Ring was destroyed, the 9 rings lost their power, and the wraiths who depended on them perished utterly. There was no recovery for them. The mouth of Sauron, the Black Númenórean who had served as Sauron's lieutenant and emissary, is not mentioned again after the Battle of the Morannon. Tolkien gives no account of his death or his survival. He vanishes from the record. The orcs present a different problem. Tolkien wrote that after Sauron's defeat, many of the orcs scattered. They had been controlled through Sauron's will and through the fear he inspired, and without that direction they broke and fled. But Tolkien did not write that every orc in Middle-earth died at the fall of Sauron. Orcs had existed before Sauron, serving Morgoth in the First Age, and they continued to exist after Sauron's destruction. What changed was their organization and their capacity for large-scale coordinated action. Without a Dark Lord to unite them, they became scattered bands, a diminished threat, but not an extinguished one. Aragorn, crowned as King Elessar, campaigned against remnants of Sauron's forces in the years after the War of the Ring. The appendices record that he hunted the remaining servants of the enemy, pursuing them into the east and south, where men had served Sauron out of fear or ambition. These campaigns are mentioned briefly, without the detail Tolkien gave to the War of the Ring itself. Frodo Baggins returned to the Shire, but he did not remain there long. The wounds he had received during the quest, the knife stroke from the Witch King at Weathertop, the sting of Shelob in Cirith Ungol, and the tooth of Gollum that had taken his finger, did not heal. Tolkien wrote that Frodo suffered from recurring pain on the anniversaries of those wounds, and that the burden of carrying the ring had marked him in ways that could not be undone. On the 22nd of September in the year 3021 of the Third Age, Frodo left the Shire. He rode to the Grey Havens, where Círdan the shipwright maintained the last port for ships sailing westward to Valinor. Gandalf was there, and so were Elrond and Galadriel, the keepers of the three rings of the elves. Bilbo Baggins, old and frail, accompanied them. Frodo had been permitted to sail because he had been a ring-bearer, and the Valar had granted him that mercy. Samwise Gamgee rode with Frodo to the Havens, but did not sail. Frodo gave Sam the book that became the Red Book of Westmarch, the record of the quest that Frodo and Bilbo had written. Frodo also gave Sam the task of finishing the story and the life that Frodo could no longer live in Middle-earth. Sam returned to the Shire, to his wife Rosie Cotton and their children, and became mayor of the Shire 7 times. Tolkien wrote in an appendix that Sam eventually sailed westward himself, years later, after Rosie died. He too had been a ring-bearer, if only briefly, and he too was permitted to seek healing in the west. Aragorn had been crowned King Elessar on the 1st of May in the year 3019 of the Third Age, shortly after the fall of Sauron. He claimed the throne of Gondor and Arnor, the 2 kingdoms of the Dúnedain in Middle-earth. Gondor had survived the War of the Ring, though its strength had diminished over centuries. Arnor had been destroyed long before, broken into the kingdoms of Arthedain, Cardolan and Rudar, and then overrun by the Witch King of Angmar. Aragorn's coronation reunited the 2 kingdoms under one king for the first time in over 1,000 years. He married Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, in the same year. Their marriage joined the line of the half-elven with the line of the kings of men. Arwen had been born in Rivendell and had lived there with her father, Elrond, who was half-elven and had the choice of which kindred to belong to. Elrond chose to be counted among the elves, and he sailed westward with Frodo. Arwen chose to be counted among men, and she remained in Middle-earth with Aragorn. She surrendered her elven immortality, binding herself to a mortal life and to a mortal husband. Tolkien wrote that Arwen and Aragorn had at least one son, Eldarion, who was born during the reign of his father. The appendices indicate that Aragorn ruled for 122 years. When he felt his age at last, he chose the manner of his death, laying down his life in the tradition of the ancient kings of Númenor. Arwen remained after him, and Tolkien wrote that she went to Lothlorien, where Galadriel had once ruled, and that the land was empty and silent. Arwen died on Serin Amroth, the hill in Lorien where she and Aragorn had once pledged themselves to each other. Eldarion succeeded his father as king, and Tolkien wrote that the line of the kings continued after him, though the details of their reigns are not recorded. The elves who remained in Middle-earth after the fall of Sauron were few, and their departure was gradual. Galadriel had kept Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, in Lothlorien. Elrond had kept Vilya, the Ring of Air, in Rivendell. Gandalf had worn Narya, the Ring of Fire, which Círdan had given to him when he first arrived in Middle-earth. All 3 rings had been made by the elfsmith Celebrimbor in the Second Age, and their power depended on the one ring. When the one ring was destroyed, the 3 rings lost their power. Lothlorien and Rivendell, the realms sustained by those rings, began to fade. Galadriel sailed westward on the same ship that carried Frodo and Gandalf. Elrond sailed with them. Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, remained in Middle-earth for a time. Tolkien wrote that he dwelt in Lothlorien for a while after Galadriel's departure, but eventually he grew weary of the fading land and went to Rivendell, where Elrond had been. From there, the appendices suggest, he too eventually sailed westward. Thranduil, the Elven king of Mirkwood, remained in his realm. His son Legolas had travelled with the Fellowship of the Ring, and after the war, Legolas brought elves from Mirkwood to Ithilien, the region east of Minas Tirith, where they restored the gardens and the land. Tolkien wrote that Legolas eventually sailed westward as well after the death of Aragorn, and that he took Gimli with him. Gimli was the only dwarf ever permitted to sail to Valinor, and that permission came from Galadriel, who had formed a bond of friendship with him during the Fellowship's time in Lothlorien. Gimli had settled in the Glittering Caves, Aglarond, behind Helm's Deep in Rohan after the war. He led a colony of dwarves there and worked the stone. The dwarves of Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, had fought in the War of the Ring, and their king, Dain Ironfoot, had died defending the Gate of Erebor. His son, Thorin Stonehelm, succeeded him, and continued the kingdom under the mountain. Tolkien wrote that the dwarves prospered in the Fourth Age, though he gave few details. Khazad-dûm, the ancient mansion of the dwarves, remained abandoned. The Balrog that had driven them out had been destroyed by Gandalf in the previous age, but Tolkien did not record that the dwarves reclaimed Khazad-dûm in the Fourth Age. Tolkien began writing a sequel to The Lord of the Rings set in the Fourth Age, but he abandoned it after a few pages. The story was called The New Shadow. It was set in the reign of Eldarion, Aragorn's son, approximately 100 years after the end of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote that the story dealt with a plot among men in Gondor, a conspiracy that drew on the lingering fear and memory of Sauron. He wrote that a cult had arisen, worshipping the old darkness, and that boys and young men were involved in secret rituals. He found the material unconvincing. In a letter he wrote that the story was not worth completing because it would have become a thriller rather than a myth, and because the evil it depicted was too small and too ordinary after the defeat of Sauron. The few pages he wrote survive in The Peoples of Middle-earth, the 12th volume of the History of Middle-earth, edited by his son Christopher. They show a Gondor at peace but restless, a kingdom that had forgotten the cost of the war and was beginning to toy with the old temptations. Tolkien's abandonment of the New Shadow is significant because it marks the limit of what he was willing to write about the Fourth Age. He had created a world in which the great evil had been defeated, and he found that the smaller evils that followed did not make the kind of story he wanted to tell. The Fourth Age, in his conception, was the Age of Men, and the Age of Men was not a time of great conflicts between light and darkness. It was a time of ordinary troubles, of politics and conspiracy, of the slow forgetting of the old world and the slow building of the new one. What Tolkien did write about the Fourth Age, scattered across the appendices and his letters, gives us fragments rather than a complete picture. He wrote that the Fourth Age was the age of the dominion of men, the time when the elves faded and departed and the dwarves diminished and withdrew. He wrote that Aragorn's reign was long and largely peaceful, and that Gondor and Arnor were restored under his kingship. He wrote that the Shire prospered, and that Samwise Gamgee and his family thrived. He wrote that Legolas and Gimli remained friends until the end, and that their friendship endured across the boundary between elf and dwarf that had stood for thousands of years. He wrote that the Ents never found the Entwives, and that the forests continued to shrink as men spread across the land. He wrote that the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones, were recovered and used by Aragorn, though some had been lost or destroyed. He wrote that the line of kings continued in Gondor through Eldarion and his descendants. He did not write a full history of the Fourth Age, and he did not try to fill the gaps with speculation. The New Shadow was his attempt, and he set it aside. What remains after the fall of Sauron is a world beginning again, recorded in fragments, and a story that Tolkien chose not to finish.